The Dreams of Ghosts and Indians, a novel by Preston Jacobs, available in paperback and ebook. And here we are for our reading and analysis of The Hedge Knight. Let's get right into it. The Hedge Knight. The spring rains had softened the ground, so Dunk had no trouble digging the grave. He chose a spot on the western slope of a low hill, for the old man had always loved to watch the sunset. "Another day done," he would sigh, "and who knows what the morrow will bring us, eh, Dunk?" Well, one morrow had brought rains that soaked them to the bones, and the one after had brought wet gusty winds, and the next, a chill. By the fourth day, the old man was too weak to ride, and now he was gone. Only a few days past, he had been singing as they rode, the old song about going to Gulltown to see a fair maid. But instead of Gulltown, he'd sung of Ashford. "Off to Ashford to see the fair maid, hey ho, hey ho," Dunk thought miserably as he dug. When the hole was deep enough, he lifted the old man's body in his arms and carried him there. He had been a small man and slim, stripped of hauberk, helm, and sword belt. He seemed to weigh no more than a bag of leaves. Dunk was hugely tall for his age, a shambling, shaggy, big-boned boy of 16 or 17 years, no one was quite certain which, who stood closer to 7 feet than to 6, and had only just begun to fill out his frame. The old man had often praised his strength. He had always been generous in his praise. It was all he had to give. And here we are at story's beginning, Dunk burying the man he squired for, Arlen of Pennytree, a likely father figure for him. And so George R. Martin has chosen to begin the story and frame the story with a transition in Dunk's life. Keep in mind that funerals are ceremonies of transition, and this opening funeral is later going to be paralleled with the funeral at the end of the story, a second transition point. Of course, Dunk is 16 or 17, a young adult, the border between childhood and manhood, so it appears that this is a coming-of-age story, a story that delves into what it means to be an adult and what it means to be a man. And we should also remember that our author faced an important decision point when he was a young man about going to Vietnam and becoming a writer, and this influences much of his writing, certainly this story in particular. Now I will say our author loves his openings and he loves his endings, and our opening has quite a bit of meaning. The story begins with, "The spring rains had softened the ground, so Dunk had no trouble digging the grave." No trouble digging the grave. And there is so much here. First off, we can tell that our author actually researched grave digging a bit. For example, Dunk is digging on a slope, which is correct for a grave as you want proper drainage. Flat earth has water puddle. But also he gets the ground correct. So during severe droughts, clay-like earth can get super hard. So it can be next to impossible to dig graves during droughts in certain areas. But the seasons changed and the rains came and moistened the earth, except wet earth is also really hard to shovel as it's filled with water. But Dunk is a really strong guy, so it's easy for him. So, in this opening, because Dunk is large, he believes he is having no trouble digging the grave. Because he's large, he believes he will have no trouble transitioning to being on his own after the death of Arlen. Because he's large, he believes he will have no difficulty transitioning from being a boy to being a man. But we know this to be absolutely wrong. Arlen told him, who knows what the morrow will bring. Arlen's wisdom is a ghost throughout this entire story, showing that Dunk didn't really bury him. Arlen will continue to help and guide Dunk, just as all of our past teachers and mentors and caregivers do for us. It's a brilliant, brilliant opening, the metaphor of the grave, and our author stole the idea from himself. It's pretty much the opening for a short story called Bitter Blooms that he wrote, where the character of Sean cannot bury her father figure because the frozen earth is too hard. It's a metaphorical representation of how she can't really move beyond him or her past and how we can't really bury the dead. Bitter Blooms, by the way, is also a story with uneven seasons, blue winter flowers, and a place called Carenhall, but anyway, hardly anyone has ever read Bitter Blooms, so it's nice that a very good idea is recycled here. a boy who believes himself ready to move past his father figure and be a man, represented by his ease in digging a grave. So, a few random bits here. We find out that they're heading to Ashford. Yes, there's an Ashford in England, but Ashford is likely a reference to Ashby, the location of the story of Ivanhoe, which our author has said was a huge influence. The song, Off to Gulltown to See a Fair Maid, we will run into again in A Storm of Swords. Tom of Seven sings it when Arya first meets him, and we find that Arlen of Pennytree was a small man, which means he was likely no great knight in terms of swordplay. Reach is an important factor in fighting, but on a horse, height is much less a factor, and Arlen seemed to have been a decent jouster. But of course, much of this is irrelevant. What makes Arlen great is the fact that he's a great teacher and a great storyteller. He laid him down in the bottom of the grave and stood over him for a time. The smell of the rain was in the air again, and he knew he ought to fill the hole before the rain broke. But it was hard to throw dirt down on that tired old face. There ought to be a septon here, to say some prayers over him, but he only has me. The old man had taught Dunk all he knew of swords and shields and lances, but he had never been much good at teaching him words. "I'd leave your sword, but it would rust in the ground," he said at last, apologetic. "The gods will give you a new one, I guess. I wish you didn't die, sir." He paused, uncertain of what else to be said. He didn't know any prayers, not all the way through. The old man had never been much for praying. "You are a true knight, and you never beat me when I didn't deserve it," he finally managed. "Except that one time in Maidenpool. It was the inn boy who ate the widow woman's pie, not me. I told you. It don't matter now. The gods keep you, sir." He kicked dirt in the hole, then began to fill it methodically, never looking at the thing at the bottom. He had a long life, Dunk thought. He must have been closer to 60 than to 50. And how many men can say that? At least he had lived to see another spring. And so here we have Dunk thinking about who Arlen was as a person and his relationship with him, cast against the utter humility of the funeral. And this is rather important. There is no septon here, and in fact, Arlen of Pennytree was not a religious man. There is no grandness of the ceremony with many people attending, as Arlen of Pennytree was a nobody for the most part. He only had Dunk. And there is no wealth to be buried with Arlen, as Arlen had very little. And yet, Arlen of Pennytree was a true knight. He was a good man. At least Dunk believed him to be. Piety didn't make him a good man. Titles and fame didn't make him a good man. Wealth didn't make him a good man. And this is really key here. What makes a good man? What makes a true knight? This is a coming-of-age story where Dunk is trying to figure out how to be an adult, how to be a man, and his mentor had none of the traditional signs of success. No piety, no fame, no wealth. So, without religion, or popular opinion, or money to measure goodness, what made Arlen so good? Well, we never find out exactly why Arlen is so good, but Arlen did take on Dunk as a child of 5 or 6, raised him, and trained him. That is, he gave him all of the tools needed to survive in this world. And for the most part, Dunk thought Arlen was good to him and just. He didn't beat Dunk unless he deserved it, except one time. Arlen wasn't perfect, but who is? At the end of the day, it seems that Arlen took on a fatherly role for Dunk. He protected him, he nurtured him, he cared for him, and perhaps that's all it takes to be good. Protecting and caring about people. Now there is something very interesting with the last sentence of the first paragraph. Dunk claims that Arlen taught him sword and lance, pretty well actually, but Dunk says that Arlen wasn't very good at teaching him words. Except, that part is proven to be completely wrong. Although Dunk's physical abilities are no doubt good, his success in the story is largely through his words, specifically his storytelling, which he gets from Arlen. Now, no items are buried with Arlen, though Dunk thinks it would be proper to bury him with his sword. Sword and armor burial actually probably wasn't done very much in our world, but it's a fairly standard fantasy trope to see knights buried in armor with swords. Now here, Dunk clearly doesn't want to leave anything of value, so he doesn't bury the sword. He's poor and needs the weapons and armor. And this is paralleled with the funeral at the end of the story, where the prince is cremated with many valuables like a gold helm and his sword. They literally have money to burn. The other big parallel with the end is the consideration of a man's life, his experiences, and the justice or injustice of when a man dies. Arlen is in his late 50s, and Dunk thinks that's a pretty old age to die at. And Dunk thinks that Arlen seeing another spring was a good enough experience to fulfill a life. It's a rather humble expectation, and this is contrasted with Story's End, when Valar believes his father was far too young to die at 39 and was robbed of all the greatness he would have done as king. This idea of injustice with life's length is brought up with Arya in A Dance with Dragons when she is angry that an insurance salesman has made it to old age when her father died so young. The sun was westering as he fed the horses. There were three: his swayback Stott, the old man's palfrey, and Thunder, his warhorse, who was ridden only in tourney and battle. The big brown stallion was not as swift or strong as he had once been, but he still had his bright eye and fierce spirit, and he was more valuable than everything else Dunk owned. If I sold Thunder an old chestnut, and the saddles and bridles too, I'd come away with enough silver to... Dunk frowned. The only life he knew was the life of a hedge knight, riding from keep to keep, taking service with this lord and that lord, fighting in their battles and eating in their halls until the war was done, then moving on. There were tourneys from time to time as well, though less often, and he knew that some hedge knights turned robber during lean winters, though the old man never had. I could find another hedge knight in need of a squire, and tend his animals and clean his mail, he thought. Or might be I could go to some city, to Lannisport or King's Landing, and join the city watch. Or else... So next Dunk considers his possessions and options in life, and we get a bit of jargon which functions as a way to give atmosphere. Westering, by the way, is the setting of the sun. The sun sets here on Dunk's old life, and it's paralleled with a sunrise at Story's End with his new life. Swayback, as in a swayback horse, is when the back of the horse arches down. It's not a good or healthy condition for a horse. And a Stott is an old worthless horse, so a swayback Stott is really worthless. A palfrey is a regular docile transportation horse. They are swift and thin. You can use them for long distance travel or hunting, but generally not for battle or hauling anything, and this is why Arlen has a separate warhorse. The term bright eye in the singular just means an alertness and is often used to describe healthy horses. The saddle, of course, is what one sits on a horse, and the bridle is the net of straps in a horse's mouth and around its face that connects with the reins. And the titular hedge knight is a knight errant, as in a wandering knight for hire without a lord. They were often the stars of medieval literature because they were free to go around having adventures. The term hedge knight was not often used before George R. R. Martin, but hedge teachers, hedge poets, hedge wizards were terms for wandering people in those vocations, people that needed to sleep outside under hedges. And George R. R. Martin said he found this term primarily in Irish history. Anyway, Dunk, considering his options here, is pretty solid evidence that no, Dunk is not a knight. He was never knighted by Sir Arlen. He has no equipment of his own, and his first instinct is to sell everything of Arlen's for coin, and his second instinct is to continue on as a squire. One would think if he were actually knighted, his first instinct would be to continue on as a knight. It's only after the or else and the ellipses that Dunk begins to act like a knight. He had piled the old man's things under an oak. The cloth purse contained 3 silver stags, 19 copper pennies, and a chipped garnet. As with most hedge knights, the greatest part of his worldly wealth had been tied up in his horses and weapons. Dunk now owned a chainmail hauberk that he had scoured the rust off 1,000 times, an iron half-helm with a broad nasal and a dent on the left temple, a sword belt of cracked brown leather, and a long sword in a wooden leather scabbard, a dagger, a razor, a whetstone, greaves and gorget, an 8-foot war lance of turned ash topped by a cruel iron point, and an oaken shield with a scarred metal rim bearing the sigil of Sir Arlen of Pennytree, a winged chalice, silver on brown. Dunk looked at the shield, scooped up the sword belt, and looked at the shield again. The belt was made for the old man's skinny hips. It would never do for him, no more than the hauberk would. He tied the scabbard to a length of hempen rope, knotted it around his waist, and drew the longsword. The blade was straight and heavy. Good castle-forged steel. The grip, soft leather wrapped over wood. The pommel, a smooth, polished black stone. Plain as it was, the sword felt good in his hand, and Dunk knew how sharp it was, having worked it with a whetstone and oilcloth many a night before they went to sleep. It fits my grip as well as it ever fit his, he thought to himself. And there is a tourney at Ashford Meadow. And so now it appears that Dunk has made his decision to pretend to be a knight and continue on to Ashford Meadow to compete in Sir Arlen's stead. And we get some more jargon for atmosphere. A garnet is a gemstone, it being chipped likely reduces its value. A hauberk is a chainmail shirt. Obviously you wouldn't want this to rust and have the rings fall apart, so you would have to have it scoured. And a half-helm is a helmet that goes only down past the nose. And it's actually a bit crazy that Arlen was using this in a joust. It's rather dangerous. In fact, Arlen was forgoing a lot of safety because he just didn't have the money. His lack of funds are shown in his cracked leather sword belt, it's beginning to fall apart, his wooden scabbard rather than a metal one, and the fact that he only has a hauberk, greaves, and a gorget in terms of armor. Greaves are shin and calf armor, and a gorget is armor for around the neck, but he has no gauntlets for his hands, pauldrons for his shoulders, cuisses for his thighs, or any plate for his chest. Just a hauberk. Of course, later we find out that it's been many years since Sir Arlen actually competed in a joust, so it may be that he got rid of armor. The artist of the comic book might have gotten things wrong, and the lance that Arlen carries is actually a war lance, not a jousting lance. As for the sword, we find that it's castle-forged steel. All steel is forged, by the way, despite what fantasy shows might show. The alternative, casting, is done for bronze, but it would create a brittle and useless steel sword. George R. Martin uses the term castle-forged a bit. I think he's trying to say that some blacksmiths would likely specialize in horseshoes and civilian metalwork, while a castle forge would specialize in weaponry and be better at it. A pommel is a balancing weight on the end of a sword's handle or grip. A whetstone is used for sharpening, and an oilcloth is used to oil the blade and prevent water and moisture from getting on the metal and making it rust. Now, as I said, it's actually been years since Sir Arlen competed in a joust, and he wasn't that great of a knight even when he was young, and so it's a bit of a mystery to why he was going to Ashford. Was it just to be a spectator? Was he going to compete in a melee? Was it educational for Dunk? I actually lean towards the last reason, that although Arlen never got around to knighting Dunk, it was his plan to make him into a great tourney knight. Perhaps out of love, perhaps so Dunk could support him in his old age, but I do think Arlen was training him. And this is a good place to stop. We will see you in part 2. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.